The courthouse was colder than usual. A draft snaked through the hallways, curling around the wooden benches and sweeping under the heavy doors of courtroom 4B. Pam Bondi adjusted her blazer, a quiet determination in her eyes as she stepped past the rows of spectators gathered for what was supposed to be a routine corruption hearing. Except this was no ordinary case. At the center of it stood Judge Malcolm Winslow, a staunch liberal figure with decades on the bench and a reputation for being untouchable. His rulings had shaped policy, his voice had commanded respect, and his alliances had granted him power. But Pam knew better. She had spent months peeling back layers of carefully constructed lies. It had started with whispers, anonymous tips, financial irregularities, witnesses too scared to speak. And then, one night, an envelope had appeared at her office. No return address. No explanation. Just one photograph, grainy but damning. It showed Winslow meeting with a known lobbyist in a dimly lit parking garage. A man whose name had been whispered in the darkest circles of backroom deals. Bondi didn't believe in coincidences. As she took her place at the plaintiff's table, she felt the weight of every eye on her. Winslow sat high on the bench, his expression unreadable. He was a man who had spent years burying secrets beneath legal jargon and technicalities. But today, Bondi was prepared to dig them up. The bailiff called the court to order. The opening arguments began. The prosecution laid out the allegations: improper financial dealings, suspicious case rulings, and a potential bribery scheme spanning years. But the defense, composed of the state's most well-connected attorneys, smirked as if they had already won. Then it was Pam's turn. She rose, walking to the center of the courtroom with the confidence of someone who had already seen the end of the game. "Your Honor, before we proceed further, I'd like to submit new evidence for the record." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Winslow raised an eyebrow. "Ms. Bondi, this is highly irregular." She reached into her briefcase, pulling out a small, unmarked USB drive. "This footage was obtained through legal channels. It directly pertains to this case." Winslow hesitated. He flicked a glance at his attorneys, who immediately objected. "Your Honor, we have not had a chance to review." "This evidence was only recently discovered," Bondi interrupted, her voice smooth but firm. "And I assure you, it will explain a great deal." Winslow exhaled sharply. "Overruled." "Let's see it." The court clerk took the USB and inserted it into the screen system. The lights dimmed slightly as the footage began. Grainy at first. A parking garage. The timestamp flickered, 2:47 a.m. A black car. A man stepping out, Judge Winslow. A second figure emerging from the shadows, a lobbyist with direct ties to a criminal syndicate. Bondi watched as Winslow's face twitched, just barely. The footage played on. The two men exchanged words, muffled but clear enough. "Winslow, you said this would never come back to me." The lobbyist: "Relax, Judge. You scratch our back, we scratch yours." Winslow: "No more favors. No more rulings. This is the last one." The sound of an envelope slapping against a palm echoed in the silence of the courtroom. Gasps rippled through the spectators. The defense attorneys scrambled, flipping through papers, whispering furiously. Pam tilted her head, watching Winslow. He wasn't moving. Not blinking. Just staring straight ahead. Then, without warning, he slammed his gavel. "I want this court cleared." "No," Pam stepped forward. Her voice was sharp as steel. "No more hiding, Judge. This court, and the people, deserve the truth." The bailiffs tensed, unsure if they were meant to follow the judge's orders or let the moment play out. Winslow leaned forward, his voice low and measured. "You have no idea who you're playing with, Ms. Bondi." She smiled. "Oh, but I do. And this is only the beginning." The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Judge Malcolm Winslow sat stiffly, his knuckles white as they gripped the edge of his bench. His usual air of authority had cracked, just slightly, but enough for Pam Bondi to know she had hit a nerve. She allowed the silence to stretch, let the weight of the evidence sink in. Every journalist, every lawyer, every spectator in that room had just watched a sitting judge accept a bribe in grainy, undeniable detail. Winslow cleared his throat, his voice controlled but barely. "This is a gross invasion of my privacy." The prosecution is clearly using illegally obtained. Objection. Pam turned, facing the judge with a steady glare. That footage was acquired through a lawful subpoena. The source, an anonymous whistleblower, provided it to authorities as part of an ongoing investigation. Winslow's defense team scrambled, flipping through their binders. One of his attorneys, a polished, silver-haired man named Theodore Kane, rose swiftly. Your Honor, I move that this evidence be struck from the record. We have no way of verifying its authenticity. This could be manipulated footage. Pam smirked, turning toward the screen where the footage had paused. The image of Winslow shaking hands with a known corporate bagman loomed behind her. I expected that argument. She pulled another item from her briefcase. A folder, thick with documents. She walked it over to the clerk's desk and slid it forward. These are forensic analysis reports from 2 independent sources. They confirm the video has not been altered, tampered with, or edited in any way. Kane hesitated. Then his expression twisted into something colder. Ms. Bondi, you're aware that accusing a judge of criminal activity is a serious allegation? She met his gaze, unflinching. And so is accepting hundreds of thousands of dollars in bribes to manipulate case rulings. The courtroom erupted. Murmurs. Shuck. The journalists were scribbling furiously, some already typing headlines into their laptops. Pam stepped forward again, this time addressing the jury. Let's talk about what we know so far. Judge Winslow has a history of lenient rulings in cases involving powerful corporate entities. But what we didn't know, until today, was that there was a financial incentive behind those rulings. She turned back to Winslow, her voice razor-sharp. Tell me, Judge, how does it feel to see yourself caught in the act? Winslow's face darkened. This is a travesty of justice. A political smear campaign. Pam slammed her hands onto the prosecution table. Spare me the theatrics. The courtroom fell dead silent. Pam's voice was cold and measured. For years, you've abused your position, twisting the law to serve your own interests. You've taken money from lobbyists, from corporate executives, and from men who expect favors in return. She took a step closer. But tell me, Your Honor, when did it stop being about justice? Winslow's eyes narrowed. Watch yourself, Ms. Bondi. She smiled. Oh, I am. And so is everyone else. She turned back to the jury. The footage you just saw? That's only part of the story. Kane bolted up from his seat again. Your Honor, the prosecution is grandstanding. Pam ignored him. She wasn't done. Judge Winslow has received over $2 million in undisclosed payments through offshore accounts. Funds linked directly to parties with vested interests in cases he ruled on. Gasps filled the room. Pam pulled out another document. Bank statements. She held them up, walking slowly past the jury box. These accounts were traced back to shell companies registered under the names of Winslow's former clerks, close associates, and even family members. Each transaction carefully disguised, until now. Winslow's expression didn't change, but his grip on the bench tightened. The jury members were riveted. Pam placed the documents on the table and turned back to Winslow. Did you really think you could bury this forever? Winslow's jaw ticked. For the first time, he had no words. But Pam wasn't done. Not even close. She took a deep breath, then delivered the final blow. I have one last witness to call to the stand. Winslow's head snapped up. Pam saw the flicker of panic in his eyes. She turned to the courtroom doors. Bailiff, please bring in Mr. Evan Fisher. The doors creaked open. A man in a dark suit stepped inside. The moment Judge Winslow saw him, his face drained of color. Because Evan Fisher was his former protege. And he was about to betray him. The air in the courtroom shifted the moment Evan Fisher stepped through the heavy oak doors. It was the kind of shift you could feel in your bones, the kind that preceded a reckoning. Pam Bondi had seen a lot in her career, but even she had to admit, Winslow looked shaken. Evan Fisher walked toward the witness stand, his shoulders squared but his eyes wary. The betrayal hung in the air like an unspoken confession. He knew what he was about to do. And so did Winslow. As Fisher was sworn in, Winslow leaned forward, gripping the edges of his bench so tightly his knuckles turned white. "This is a mistake, Evan," he murmured, just loud enough for the defense team to hear. Pam caught it too. Good. Let him feel desperate. She approached the witness stand, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "Mr. Fisher, could you please state your relationship to Judge Winslow?" Fisher cleared his throat. "I was his clerk. For 5 years." Pam nodded. "And in that time, did you ever witness any behavior that seemed inappropriate?" Fisher hesitated. A flicker of something ugly crossed his face. Guilt. Shame. Fear. Then he exhaled sharply. "Yes." A single word, but it cut through the courtroom like a gunshot. Winslow shifted in his seat. "Objection," his lead attorney snapped. "This is vague and misleading." "Sustained," Winslow said quickly, his voice tight. "Ms. Bondi, be specific." Pam smiled. She had expected this. She turned back to Fisher. "Let me rephrase. Mr. Fisher, did you ever witness Judge Winslow accepting bribes?" Silence. A bead of sweat formed at Fisher's temple. He swallowed, then nodded. "Yes." Another murmur spread through the room. Winslow's attorney shot to his feet. "Objection! Where is the proof? This is hearsay." Pam lifted a thick folder from the table and walked it over to the clerk. "Your Honor, I am submitting into evidence email exchanges, bank records, and internal memos, all provided by Mr. Fisher, detailing the systematic bribery and case rigging that has taken place over the last decade." Winslow's fingers twitched. He knew what was in that folder. He knew exactly how bad it was. Pam turned back to Fisher. "Tell the jury, in your own words, what you saw." Fisher took a deep breath. "I was responsible for reviewing case files before they landed on Judge Winslow's desk," he said. "There were cases where decisions had already been made before they were heard in court. Rulings were being dictated by external parties." Pam arched a brow. "External parties, meaning?" Fisher's Adam's apple bobbed. "Lobbyists, corporate lawyers, people who had financial interests in certain verdicts." Pam walked a little closer. "Were these instructions given to you directly?" "Yes," Fisher said. Then, after a pause, "by Judge Winslow himself." Winslow shot up from his seat. "That's a damn lie." The courtroom erupted. The judge's outburst was unprecedented. A sitting judge, losing his composure in his own courtroom? Unheard of. The bailiffs took a step closer, their eyes locked on Winslow. He realized his mistake almost instantly and sat back down, his jaw clenched, his chest rising and falling in rapid breaths. Pam turned back to Fisher. "Can you tell us about the offshore accounts?" Fisher nodded, his voice steadier now. "Judge Winslow used a network of shell companies to funnel money from these bribes into accounts overseas. I helped file some of the paperwork. At first, I didn't know what I was doing. I thought they were legitimate holdings. But then I noticed the patterns. The payments. The case outcomes that aligned perfectly with those payments." Pam let the words settle. Then, she picked up the final document. A signed statement from a forensic accountant, detailing the exact transfers from those accounts. "Your Honor," she said, turning to the jury, "I submit into evidence a full breakdown of the $2.3 million Judge Winslow received from these transactions." The jurors stared at the papers. This wasn't circumstantial. This wasn't speculation. This was proof. Winslow's attorney's voice cracked when he spoke. "Your Honor, the defense moves for a recess." Pam turned, slowly. "A recess?" she repeated, arching a brow. "Your client just exploded in open court after his own former clerk testified against him. And now you want a break." Winslow's jaw was clenched so tight it looked painful. Pam stepped forward. "No recess. No delays. Judge Winslow, this trial is about you abusing your position to benefit the powerful while ordinary people suffered. And today," she turned to the jury, her voice ringing through the courtroom, "he finally has to answer for it." She leaned in, her voice lower but just as sharp. "You're out of time." Winslow's face was ashen. Pam had him. Judge Malcolm Winslow was cornered. The courtroom wasn't his anymore. He had spent decades ruling over the space, his word carrying the weight of finality. But now, he was the one on trial, his crimes laid bare, his control slipping away like sand through his fingers. Pam Bondi stood at the center of the storm, unwavering. She could see it now, the fear in Winslow's eyes. He wasn't worried about the trial anymore. No, the trial was just a formality. He was worried about what would happen after. Because once the gavel fell, there would be no coming back. The defense team was scrambling. Theodore Kane, Winslow's lead attorney, flipped through his notes with a speed that reeked of desperation. "Your Honor," he said, barely able to keep his voice steady, "the prosecution has presented a highly speculative case built on circumstantial evidence and unverified testimony." Pam let out a sharp laugh. "Unverified?" she echoed. "We just watched video footage of Judge Winslow accepting a bribe. We heard his own former clerk testify to his involvement in rigging cases. And we've submitted forensic evidence confirming millions of dollars in illegal transfers." She turned to the jury. "If this is circumstantial, then I suppose the sun rising in the morning is just a coincidence." Winslow's hands trembled. Kane stammered, his well-rehearsed confidence beginning to crack. "That video could have been misinterpreted." Pam pounced. "Let's test that theory." She strode over to the evidence monitor. The pause screen from the damning footage was still displayed, Winslow's hand gripping an envelope stuffed with cash. She hit play. Winslow's voice echoed through the silent courtroom. "You said this would never come back to me." The jury watched as the lobbyist handed over the money. Pam let the scene play out, let them see it, hear it, feel it. Then she turned back to the jury. "Was that misinterpreted?" The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone in the room. Winslow looked sick. Pam wasn't done. She walked over to the witness stand, where Evan Fisher still sat, looking pale but resolute. "Mr. Fisher," she said, her voice softer now, "tell me, why did you come forward?" Fisher swallowed hard. Because I was tired of living with the guilt. I knew what we were doing was wrong. And I realized that if I stayed silent, I was just as guilty." He turned his gaze toward Winslow. "I looked up to you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I believed in you. But you used the law as a weapon. And I couldn't live with that anymore." Pam let his words hang in the air. She turned to the jury. "This is what corruption looks like. It isn't just about money. It's about power. It's about trust being shattered. It's about justice being stolen from those who need it most." She took a deep breath. "And that ends today." The room was silent. Then Judge Winslow stood. His chair scraped against the floor as he pushed it back. He stared at Pam, his once unbreakable mask finally shattered. His lips parted like he wanted to say something, to defend himself, to lash out, to salvage what was left of his legacy. But there was nothing left to say. He looked down. Then, in the most stunning moment of the entire trial, he turned to his own attorneys and muttered, "No more." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Kane's eyes bulged. "Your Honor, I strongly advise." Winslow held up a shaking hand. "No," his voice was hoarse. Defeated. He turned to the jury. I can't fight this anymore." A cold sweat had broken out across his brow. His once commanding presence had withered into something small. "I did it," he said, his voice cracking. "All of it." The courtroom erupted. Gasps. Shouting. Journalists scrambling to document the moment a sitting judge admitted his own corruption in open court. Pam stood still. Watching. Waiting. Winslow exhaled sharply. He looked at her, at the woman who had torn down his empire with nothing but the truth. Then he looked away. The bailiffs stepped forward. They took him into custody right then and there. The gavel slammed down, but Winslow didn't flinch. It was over. Pam exhaled slowly. As the courtroom emptied, reporters swarmed, cameras flashed, voices clamored. But Pam, she just stood there. The battle was won. And justice had prevailed.